Hi guys, and welcome back to Patreon tutorials. So for today I thought I'd go over my tips for drawing curved lines and how to create nice smooth clean line art in your drawings. So what you're going to need is a piece of paper and some pencils. Ideally something quite smooth is useful in this kind of style of drawing. If you find that your paper is quite textured, it can prove difficult to make nice smooth lines. That's just from my experience anyway. So I do recommend using something that is quite smooth in texture. And as for pencils, I like to go with my trusty mechanical pencils. This one here is a very fine, it's a 0.3mm mechanical pencil with a B lead, so a nice bold pencil. And this one is a 0.7mm mechanical pencil with a 2B lead. So I do recommend going for something nice and soft, and I'll show you why in a second. So let's jump in to today's tutorial. So we're going to start off by learning how to do curved lines. Now, lots of people can struggle with this, especially making them look quite smooth and clean. So I thought that I would give one of my favourite tricks for drawing curved lines. So I'm going to use my pencil. Again, I'm going to use my 0.7mm 2B lead, just to give you an example. You can use whatever you have to hand, that's absolutely fine. So when you're drawing, I like to try and move as much from the elbow as possible. So I'm not really flexing my wrist, and I'm not really using my fingers, even though that does kind of come into play, especially if you're trying to keep quite fluid with your motions. But a lot of my movement comes from the elbow, maybe even from the shoulder. So actually the pivot point is up in my shoulder. But that's where to keep most of the motion. And when you do that and you kind of take out the tension, take out the movement from the wrist, you actually give yourself a bit more fluidity, a little bit more flow, and it allows you to kind of make curved lines quite nicely. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to pay attention to the fact that when I hinge, I'm able to draw the curved line like so. So the dome of the curve is away from me. So all I do is keeping it nice and light, move from the elbow, very light curve. So you can either build up from that again. So all of the motion that I'm doing is coming from the elbow, coming from the shoulder, and it's keeping that curve nice and smooth. So one thing I find, which can be quite tricky for some people, is doing the reverse. So when you want to bring the dome towards you, you can still do it from the elbow. However, what I would suggest is to turn the paper. And I'll show you how this combines into the drawing that I'm going to do later. But instead of kind of, reversing the motion, just turn the page and you're able to kind of keep that motion the same, keep it nice and loose, and still maintain that curve. And turning the paper gives you that flexibility, like so. And this can come in really handy, provided you're able to actually turn the paper. Obviously, if you've got an illustration that is, say, stuck down, or you're doing a watercolour, and for example, you've sellotaped it down, can get tricky. However, this is just the easiest way I've found to enable myself to do that nice fluid curve without making quite an awkward movement and pulling that in with me. It's still possible, but I just suggest keeping it nice and easy for yourself and turn that paper. So it's a really simple, really basic tip, to be honest. It's nothing mind-blowing, nothing kind of extraordinary, but it is just a really nice little hack for kind of creating those curved lines without making these kind of awkward, uncomfortable movements, which may in turn cause that line to be either straighter or too curved or whatever. You've got a little bit more control just by maintaining that nice curve, especially whilst I'm recommending drawing from the elbow. If you're doing from the wrist, again, that joint, it pivots like so, and it makes it just that much easier to keep the dome away from you, like so. And instead of drawing like this, which automatically gets quite clunky, it's not nearly as smooth, I'm just pulling in with my fingers. If I maintain that motion of the wrist, I can just turn that page and bring that curve in nicely, like so. So cool. Really simple tip. Just thought I'd pass that on just in case it would be useful to people. But now I'm going to move on to doing smooth, clean line art. So what I'll do is I'll zoom on this part of the page and show you what I'm doing to make it easier to draw really nice, clean line art. So when drawing really nice, clean, smooth line art, you can do it kind of multiple ways, but I'll show you my favourite technique. One way to do it, which isn't my kind of preferred method, but one way that you can create nice, smooth lines, is by doing lines in kind of long consistent motions and just going nice and slow and building up that line. And you can do nice curved or nice clean line art like so, but the reason I don't tend to do it this way is because it doesn't give me as much kind of thickness or depth to the line as I like to do. And especially if you're doing the same area over and over again in order to build up a bit of thickness, you can create these kind of air pockets, which isn't necessarily ideal, unless that's obviously something as a stylistic choice. But what I like to do is I like to always go with a soft lead, for example this 2B. And I'm going to use it really lightly, and I'm going to do the same curve, but I'm going to do it in several sketchy motions. So I'm going to sketch out that curve that I like. So I am mainly keeping with my fingertips at this point in time, so there's not much movement in my wrist or my shoulders, just to keep that curve nice and tight. Obviously I could do the same for my elbow, but what I'm doing is I'm drawing really lightly. And when I finally have that curve, or that line, whatever it is that I'm drawing, so if we do a straight line, I can build up that line lightly, and then I'm going to go over the same line repeatedly until I get the desired depth. And what this does is, because I'm drawing in fairly short, sketchy lines, even though the texture is not quite as smooth as this actually, what it is, it does give this kind of softness. And then you can go over it again and again. I'm not pressing too heavy with my pencil, but what I am doing is I'm building up that pigment and allowing that kind of shade to come through. And this can create a really lovely soft gradient. Say if you wanted to do, say, a thicker or heavier line up here, and then you can kind of bring in that shade lower down. And actually you can maybe bring in a bit of darker down here, and it just makes that line a little bit more interesting. So if I did the same in just one stroke, well, again, I've pressed quite lightly here, but I find it tricky to make that line as interesting as if I'm just building up that pigment gradually by sketching over the top. So for example, this line I did in one sweeping motion, and that is a technique you can use. And doing one sweeping motion when you're drawing your line art is a completely legitimate tactic. So for example, you can do a little horse here and do lots of just singular lines. You can create, and probably lots of artists will encourage people to do it in long sweeping motions just because it creates a bit of fluidity. But when it comes to building up line work, especially if I'm doing a sort of nice illustrated piece, I find it's really nice to build up that line gradually. And it gives me more control. So I'm just going to sketch in again this line, doing the same motion repeatedly, but at the same quite light pressure. And it just brings that line to, it looks more aesthetically pleasing, in my opinion anyway. Just because there's soft areas, there's hard, heavy areas, and it allows you to create with more control. Whereas, you know, these lines, you can train in that control, but actually doing it in one long sweeping motion, you're kind of at the mercy of wherever your arm goes. So when you're building up an illustration, if you want lots of control, something I do is this particular technique. So I'm doing that same line over and over until I build up the exact weight, thickness of the line, the exact shade of the line as I want. Say for example, I want to make some nice, quite light lines going across, just for a bit of interest. And it adds this kind of visual appeal that you can do. So one thing you could do in this kind of sweeping motion is varying the line pressure as you go. So what you could start off with quite a heavy pressure, bring it up to a lighter pressure, bring it down to a thickness when you press a bit more heavy, like you can, like I'm doing here by mimicking that by building it up slowly. So you can do it, but it just requires allowing yourself to press kind of heavy at the beginning and varying the weight of that by pressing lightly. So it is possible, and you can create quite nice clean lines like so, but that requires a little bit more practice, just because there's a little bit less control in it at the beginning. You'll find that many artists can do, I've got an example of an illustration done by a Turkish artist, and she does the most incredible piece, and all it is a few simple lines, but she's rehearsed that over and over again, and now she's got this image that she can create just by kind of doing a few simple sweeps of the pencil. So that it is possible to get this level of control in one motion, but for me personally, I enjoy building up that that clean line art by repeating the same motion over and over again, using a lighter pressure, and using a softer lead to be able to get those darker lines without actually having to press too hard. So essentially what softer lead does, especially if it's graphite, it's just the graphite kind of pigment molecules come free from the lead quite a bit easier. So it's just a softer lead, and when you kind of do the same motion over and over again, you're just applying more of the molecules, or the graphite pigment, and just doing it over and over again. You can get that same level of darkness as if you pressed hard, but actually you're still more comfortable because you're not pressing too heavy, but you can still get that darkness in quite a pleasant way. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how I go about kind of doing my line art, and combine it with the kind of the curve techniques on a little illustration of a horse which I've sketched out already for you. So let's get started. So for this illustration, I'm going to come in with my soft leaded 0.3mm pencil, just because I really like, if I'm drawing smaller, for example, like this horse is on the small side, I find it nicer to draw with a finer lead. But all the techniques still apply. So as always, I like to start with, once I've done my sketching, I start to kind of flesh out the face, just because it looks nicer. And it kind of gives me the sense of this character coming to life. So I'm going to zoom in on the face and you can see what I'm doing a bit better. So to start off with the face, there is a slight curve in the illustration I've drawn. So I'm paying attention to that curving motion which I showed you at the beginning. And also paying attention to that building up the line weight like I also showed you. So again, repeating the motions over the same areas and building up that pigment to create quite a soft yet sharp, which I think are two very polar opposite descriptions of the word, but maintaining that kind of fine detail or fine line, clean line art, and just going over the same area in a kind of a sketchy, almost scribbly way. And just building up the pigment by repeating the motion over and over again. So when I get to a darker area, you know, it's kind of up to you whether you fill in that area with quite a heavy pressure, but I'm just going to do the same very light pressure and then go over again until I get the desired pencil weight. I'm going to do the eye. So again, all of my line art is done in the same way, and very much repeating the same lines over and over again until I get the desired weight. Entirely up to you whether you do this kind of style, this technique. For example, I could just do this whole jawline in the singular line, and that can create a very nice fine line, but I like to add a little bit of thickness to certain areas and just makes that line work a little bit more interesting. I'm going to go back here, again do that kind of light sketchy area and build up that pigment like so. Essentially repeating the line, even if I go say further than I wanted to. For example, this jawline's a little bit thicker than I'd intended, I can still just kind of go with it and kind of rock it and adjust it to suit. Bring in a cheekbone. So in this way, you know, it does mean if you're doing the same line over and over again that it kind of takes longer to do the illustration or do the drawing than if you were doing lots of, say, flowy lines, which is something I do recommend if you want to practice it. But when I'm thickening that line up, I will repeat myself over and over again until I get that desired line width. So yeah, like I said, it can mean that the illustration takes longer. It does require some patience, but obviously the more you do it, the better you get anyway. So I'm just going to carry on with this illustration. Again, doing the same sketchy line to build up that line thickness that I want. Bring it down. And paying attention to that curve. So I've actually got my hand on this side of the curve. It's much more natural, much more efficient to draw the curve this side. So I could, for this curve for example, bring my hand to this side. But what I might do, just so I can keep my arm in the same position as I have done, so I'm going to tilt the paper so I can start building up that line in the same motion without worrying too much about the placement of my arm because it kind of stays the same. I'll just kind of rotate the paper to suit and build up the line art as I go. Do some thick and thin lines. So I've got a thin line, thick line, where I build up the pigment, a little bit of thin line, a little bit of thick line to build up the pigment. And it just gives you this ability to control the line art in a really nice, manageable way. So you can still do those, for example, from my main tutorials I did before, the lovely kind of curvy S shapes and C shapes. You know, doing one technique doesn't mean you have to automatically not do the other one. You can still kind of combine these techniques to suit you. And I've got to the curve of the back, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to tilt that paper, or turn that paper so I can keep my hand in the same position and do that curve so it's natural. And get to the rump. Again, turn that paper and do that curve. It just makes that curve line a little bit more natural and easier, so it's not my hand doing anything awkward. So yeah, I'm just gonna work on this little illustration and I'll see you back at the end in a moment. So there you have it. Those are my ways of creating quite nice clean line art when I'm doing my drawings. Like I said, it's that repeated movement over the same area, kind of moving the paper in order to get that curve more natural, which helps kind of create that sense of clean line and flow, which then makes it look just so much more kind of smooth and kind of pretty to look at. As you can see, I've got kind of thicker lines, got thinner lines. It just makes that sketch look a little bit more interesting. And then once I get to this point, I can kind of come in and start adding in some shading, as you know, as you desire. Bring in a few sketchy lines to kind of add a bit of more interest, to define those muscles, those ribs perhaps. But this is about line art, so I'll stick with this for now. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Again, really simple, really straightforward, just ways of making curved lines a little bit more easy for you, and how to make those line art nice and clean, sharp, with again a visual interest, such as doing the same line over and over again until build up that pigment. And you get that kind of depth as well of the line, which makes it just that much more interesting to look at. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again for the next video. Bye guys.